Section 26 of Lavender Lit 101 collection. The Closing Door by Angelina W. Grimké. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Closing Door by Angelina W. Grimké. I was 15 at the time, diffident and old far beyond my years, from much knocking about from pillar to post, a yellow, scrawny, unbeautiful girl, when the big heart of Agnes Milton took pity upon me, loved me, and brought me home to live with her in her tiny, sun-filled flat. We were only distantly related, very distantly, in fact, on my dead father's side. You can see, then, there was no binding blood tie between us, that she was under absolutely no obligation to do what she did. I have wondered, time and again, how many women would have opened their hearts and their homes as Agnes Milton did to a forlorn, unattractive, homeless woman. That one fine, free, generous act of hers alone shows the wonder quality of her soul. Just one little word to explain me. After my father had taken one last cup too many, and they had carried him, for the last time, out of the house into which he had been carried so often, my mother, being compelled to work again, returned to the rich family with whom she had been a maid before her marriage. She regarded me as seriously, I suppose, as she did anything in the world, but as it was impossible to have me with her, I was passed along from one of her relatives to another. When one tired of me, on I went to the next. Well, I can say this for each and all of them, they certainly believed in teaching me how to work. Judging by the number of homes in which I lived until I was 15, my mother was rich indeed in one possession, an abundance of relatives. And then came Agnes Milton. Have you ever, I wonder, known a happy person? I mean a really happy one? He is as rare as a white blackbird in this somber faced world of ours. I have known two, and only two. They were Agnes Milton and her husband Jim, and their happiness did not last. Jim was a brown, good-natured giant with a slow, most attractive smile and gleaming teeth. He spoke always in a deep, sad drawl, and you would have thought him the most unhappy person imaginable, until you glimpsed his black eyes fairly twinkling under their half-closed lids. He made money, which is called easy money, by playing ragtime for dances. He was one of a troupe that are called social entertainers. As far as Jim was concerned, it would have slipped away in just as easy a manner if it hadn't been for Agnes. For she, in spite of all her seeming carefree joyousness, was a thrifty soul. As long as Jim could have good food and plenty of it, now and then the theater, a concert or a dance, and his gold-tipped cigarettes, she didn't care what became of his money. Oh, Ag! If I close my eyes, I can hear his slow, sad voice as clearly as though these 10 long years had not passed by. I can hear the click of the patent lock as he closed the flat door. I can hear the bang of his hat as he hung it on the rack. I can get the whiff of his cigarette. Oh, Ag! That you, Jim? I can see Agnes's happy eyes and hear her eager, soft voice. And then, after a pause, that sad voice. No, Ag. I can hear her delighted little chuckle. She very seldom laughed outright. Where are you anyway? It was the plaintive voice again. Here. And then he'd make believe he couldn't find her and go hunting her all over that tiny flat, searching for her in every room he knew she was not. and he'd stumble over things in pretended excitement and haste, and grunt and swear, all in that inimitable, slow way of his. And she'd stand there, her eyes shining, and every once in a while giving that dear little chuckle of hers. Finally he'd appear in the door, panting and disheveled, and would look at her in pretended intense surprise for a second, and then he'd say, in an aggrieved voice, "'S not fair, Agnes, 's not fair." She wouldn't say a word, just stand there smiling at him. After a little, slowly, he'd begin to smile too. That smile of theirs was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen, and each meeting it was the same. Their joy and love seemed to gush up and bubble over through their lips and eyes. Presently he'd say, "Catch!" She'd hold up her little white apron by the corners, and he'd put his hand in his pocket and bring out sometimes a big, sometimes a little, wad of greenbacks and toss it to her, and she'd catch it, too, I can tell you. And her eyes would beam and dance at him over it. Oh, she didn't love the money for itself, but him for trusting her with it. For fear you may not understand, I must tell you no more generous soul ever lived than Agnes Milton. Look at what she did for me. And she was always giving a nickel or a dime to some child, flowers or fruit to a sick woman, money to tide over a friend. No beggar was ever turned away empty from her flat. But she managed somehow to increase her little hoard in the bank against that possible rainy day. Well, to return. At this juncture Jim would say, "Oh," so sadly, his eyes fairly twinkling. "Please, ma'am, do I get paid today, too?" And then she'd screw up her mouth and twist her head to the side and look at him and say in a most judicial manner, "Well now, I really can't say as to that. It strikes me you'll have to find that out for yourself." Oh, they didn't mind me. He would reach her, it seemed, in one stride, and would pick her up bodily, apron, money and all. After a space she'd disentangle herself and say sternly, shaking the while her little forefinger before his delighted eyes, "Jim Milton, you've overdrawn your wages again." And then he'd look, oh, so contrite and so upset and so shocked at being caught in such a gigantic piece of attempted fraud. "No," he'd say. If you only could have heard the mournful drawl of his. "No. Now, is that so? I'm really at heart an honest, hard working man. I'll have to pay it back." He did. I can vouch for it. Sometimes, after this, he'd swing her up onto his shoulder, and they'd go dashing and prancing and shrieking and laughing all over the little flat. Once, after I had seen scared faces appearing at various windows, at times like these, I used to rush around and shut the windows down tight. Two happy children, that's what they were then, younger even than I. There was just the merest suspicion of a cloud over their happiness these days. They had been married 5 years and had no children. It was the mother heart of Agnes that had yearned over me, had pity upon me, loved me, and brought me to live in the only home I have ever known. I have cared for people, I care for Jim, but Agnes Milton is the only person I have ever really loved. I love her still. And before it was too late, I used to pray that in some way I might change places with her and go into that darkness where, though still living, one forgets sun and moon and stars and flowers and winds, and love itself, and existence means dark, foul-smelling cages, hollow, clanging doors, hollow, monotonous days. But a month ago, when Jim and I went to see her, she had changed. She had receded even from us. She seemed, how can I express it? Blank, empty, a gray automaton, a mere shell. No soul looked out at us through her vacant eyes. We did not utter a word during our long journey homeward. Jim had unlocked the door before I spoke. "Jim," I said, "they may still have the poor husk of her cooped up there, but her soul, thank God, at least for that, is free at last." And Jim, I cannot tell of his face, said never a word but turned away and went heavily down the stairs. And I went into Agnes Milton's flat and closed the door. You would never have dreamed it was the same place. For a long time I stood amid all the brightness and mockery of her sun-drenched rooms, and I prayed. Night and day I have prayed since, the same prayer, that God, if He knows any pity at all, may soon, soon release the poor spent body of hers. I wish I might show you Agnes Milton of those far off happy days. She wasn't tall and she wasn't short. She wasn't stout and she wasn't thin. Her back was straight and her head high. She was rather graceful, I thought. In coloring she was Spanish or Italian. Her hair was not very long, but it was soft and silky and black. Her features were not too sharp, her eyes clear and dark, a warm leaf brown in fact. Her mouth was really beautiful. This doesn't give her, I find. It was the shining beauty and gaiety of her soul that lighted up her whole body and somehow made her her. And she was generally smiling or chuckling. Her eyes almost closed when she did so, and there were the most delightful crinkles all about them. Under her left eye was a small scar, a reminder of some childhood escapade that became, when she smiled, the most adorable of dimples. One day, I remember, we were standing at the window in the bright sunlight. Some excitement in the street below had drawn us. I turned to her, the reason has gone from me now, and called out suddenly, "Agnes Milton!" Heavens, what is it? Why, you're wrinkling. Wrinkling? Where? And she began inspecting the smooth freshness of her house dress. "No, your face!" I exclaimed. "Honest. Stand still there in that light. Now, just look at them, all around your eyes." She chuckled. "How you ever expect me to see them I don't know without a glass or anything." And her face crinkled up into a smile. "There, that's it. That's how you get them." "How?" "Smiling too much." "Oh, no. Lucy, child, that's impossible." "How do you mean impossible? You didn't get them that way?" "Just wait till I get a glass." "No, don't." And she stopped me with a detaining hand. "I'm not doubting you. What I mean is, it's absolutely impossible to smile too much." I felt my eyes stretching with surprise. "You mean," I said, "you don't mind being wrinkled? You, a woman?" She shook her head at me many times, smiling and chuckling softly the while. "Not the very littlest, tiniest bit. Not this much." And she showed me just the barest tip of her pink tongue between her white teeth. She smiled then, and there was the dimple. "And you only 25?" I exclaimed. She didn't answer for a moment, and when she did, she spoke quietly. "Lucy, child, we've all got to wrinkle some time, somehow, if we live long enough. I'd much rather know mine were smile ones than frown ones." She waited a second, and then looked at me with her beautiful clear eyes, and added, "Wouldn't you?" For reply I leaned forward and kissed them. I loved them from that time on. Here is another memory of her, perhaps the loveliest of them all, and yet, as you will see, tingled with the first sadness. It came near the end of our happy days. It was a May dusk. I had been sewing all the afternoon and was as close to the window as I could get to catch the last of the failing light. I was trying to thread a needle, had been trying for several minutes in fact, and was just in the very act of succeeding when two soft hands were clapped over my eyes. "Oh, Agnes," I said, none too pleasantly. It was provoking. "There! You made me lose my needle." "Bother your old needle, Crosspatch," she said close to my ear. She still held her hands over my eyes. I waited a moment or so. "Well," I said, "what's the idea?" "Please don't be cross," came the soft voice still close to my ear. "I'm not." At that she chuckled. "Well," I said, "I'm trying to tell you something." "Shh, not so loud." "Well, go ahead then. And why must I shh?" "Because you must." I waited. "Well," I said a third time, but in a whisper to humour her. We were alone in the flat. There was no reason I could see for this tremendous secrecy. "I'm waiting for you to be sweet to me." "I am. But why should I have to lose my needle and my temper and be blinded and sweet just to hear something, is beyond me." "Because I don't wish you to see me while I say it." Her soft lips were kissing my ear. "Well, I'm very sweet now. What is it?" There was another little pause, and during it her fingers over my eyes trembled a little. She was breathing quicker too. "Agnes, Milton, what is it?" "Wait, I'm just trying to think how to tell you. Are you sure you're very sweet?" "Sure." I loved the feel of her hands and sat very still. "Lucy." "Yes." "What do you think would be the loveliest thing for you to know was there, close, just under your heart?" But I waited for no more. I took her hands from my eyes and turned to look at her. The beauty of her face made me catch my breath. At last I said, "You mean?" I didn't need to finish. "Yes, yes, and I'm so happy, 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 and so is Jim." "Agnes, oh my dear, and so am I." And I kissed her two dear eyes. "But why mustn't I whoop? I've simply got to," I added. "No, no, no. Oh, sh!" And for the very first time I saw fear in her eyes. "Agnes," I said, "what is it?" "I'm just a little afraid, I believe." "Afraid!" I had cried out in surprise. "Sh, Lucy. Yes." "But of what?" I spoke in a half whisper too. "You mean you're afraid you may die?" "Oh, no, not that." "What then?" "Lucy." Her answer came slowly, a little abstractedly. "There's such a thing as being too happy, too happy." "Nonsense," I answered. But she only shook her head at me slowly many times, and her great wistful eyes came to mine and seemed to cling to them. It made my heart fairly ache, and I turned my head away so that she couldn't see her fears were affecting me. And then, quite suddenly, I felt a disagreeable little chill run up and down my back. "Lucy," she said after a little. "Yes?" I was looking out of the window and not at her. "Do you remember Kipling's Without Benefit of Clergy?" I did, and I said so. Agnes had Kipling bound in 10 beautiful volumes. She loved him. At first that had been enough for me, and then I had come to love him for himself. I had read all of those 10 volumes through from cover to cover, poetry and all. "You haven't forgotten Amira, then?" "No." "Poor Amira." She was thoughtful a moment, and then went on. "She knew what it was to be too happy. Do you remember what she said once to Holden?" Again I felt that queer little shiver. "She said many things, as I remember, Agnes. Which?" "This was after Tota's death." "Well?" "They were on the roof, she and Holden, under the night." Her eyes suddenly widened and darkened, and then she went on. She turned to Holden and said, "We must make no protestations of delight, but go softly underneath the stars, lest God find us out." She paused. "Do you remember?" "Yes," I answered, but I couldn't look at her. "Well," she spoke slowly and quietly, "I have a feeling here, Lucy," and she placed her left hand against her heart, "here, that Jim and you and I must go softly, very softly, underneath the stars." Again I felt that unpleasant chill up and down my back. She stood just where she was for a little space, her hand still against her heart and her eyes wide, dark and unseeing, fixed straight ahead of her. Then suddenly, and without a sound, she turned and went towards the door and opened it. I started to follow her, but she put up her hand. "No, Lucy, please. I wish to be alone for a little." And with that she went and shut the door very slowly, quite noiselessly behind her. The closing was so slow, so silent, that I could not tell just when it shut. I found myself trembling violently. A sudden and inexplicable terror filled me as that door closed behind her. We were to become accustomed to it, Jim and I, as much as it was possible to do so, in those terrible days that were to follow. We were to become used to entering a room in search of Agnes, only to find it empty and the door opposite closing, almost imperceptibly, noiselessly, and yes, at last, irrevocably, between us. And each time it happened, the terror was as fresh upon me as at the very first. The days that immediately followed I cannot say were really unhappy ones. More to humour Agnes at first than anything else, we went softly. But as time passed even we became infected. Literally and figuratively, we began to go softly under the stars. We came to feel that each of us moved ever with a finger to his lips. There came to be also a sort of expectancy upon us, a listening, a waiting. Even the neighbours noticed the difference. Jim still played his ragtime and sang, but softly. We laughed and joked, but quietly. We got so we even washed the dishes and pots and pans quietly. Sometimes Jim and I forgot, but as certainly as we did, there was Agnes in the door, dark-eyed, a little pale, and her "Oh, Jim! Oh, Lucy! Shh!" I haven't spoken of this before because it wasn't necessary. Agnes had a brother called Bob. He was her favourite of all her brothers and sisters. He was younger than she, 5 years, I think, a handsome, harum-scarum, happy-go-lucky, restless, reckless daredevil, but sweet-tempered and good-hearted and lovable withal. I don't believe he knew what fear was. His home was in Mississippi, a small town there. It was the family home, in fact. Agnes had lived there herself until she was 17 or 18. He had visited us 2 or 3 times, and you can imagine the pandemonium that reigned at such times, for he had come during our happy days. Well, he was very fond of Agnes, and, as irresponsible as he seemed, one thing he never failed to do, and that was to write her a letter every single week. Each Tuesday morning, just like clockwork, the very first mail there was his letter. Other mornings Agnes was not so particular, but Tuesday mornings she always went herself to the mail box in the hall. It was a Tuesday morning about 4 months, maybe, after my first experience with the closing door. The bell rang 3 times, the postman's signal when he had left a letter. Agnes came to her feet, her eyes sparkling. "My letter from Bob," she said, and made for the door. She came back slowly, I noticed, and her face was a little pale and worried. She had an opened and an unopened letter in her hand. "Well, what does Bob say?" I asked. "This This isn't from Bob," she said slowly. "It's only a bill." "Well, go ahead and open his letter," I said. "There there wasn't any, Lucy." "What?" I exclaimed. I was surprised. "No, I don't know what it means." "It will come probably in the second mail," I said. "It has sometimes." "Yes," she said, I thought rather listlessly. "It didn't come in the second mail, nor in the third." "Agnes," I said, "there's some good explanation. It's not like Bob to fail you." "No." "He's busy, or got a girl maybe." She was a little jealous of him, and I hoped this last would rouse her, but it didn't. "Yes, maybe that's it," she said, without any life. "Well, I hope you're not going to let this interfere with your walk," I said. "I had thought," she began, but I cut her off. "You promised Jim you'd go out every single day," I reminded her. "All right, Agnes Milton's conscience," she said, smiling a little. "I'll go then." She hadn't been gone 15 minutes when the electric bell began shrilling continuously throughout the flat. Somehow I knew it meant trouble. My mind immediately flew to Agnes. It took me a second or so to get myself together and then I went to the tube. "Well?" I called. My voice sounded strange and high. A boy's voice answered. "Lady here named Mrs. James Milton?" "Yes," I managed to say. "Telegram for youse." It wasn't Agnes after all. I drew a deep breath. Nothing else seemed to matter for a minute. "Say," the voice called up from below, "what's the matter wid youse up dere?" "Bring it up," I said at last. "Third floor, front." I opened the door and waited. The boy was taking his time and whistling as he came. "Here," I called out as he reached our floor. It was inside his cap and he had to take it off to give it to me. I saw him eyeing me rather curiously. "You Mrs. Milton?" he asked. "No, but this is her flat. I'll sign for it. She's out. Where do I sign? There? Have you a pencil?" With the door shut behind me again, I began to think out what I had better do. Jim was not to be home until late that night. Within 5 minutes I had decided. I tore open the yellow envelope and read the message. It ran: "Bob died suddenly. Under no circumstances come. Father." The rest of that day was a nightmare to me. I concealed the telegram in my waist. Agnes came home finally and was so alarmed at my appearance I pleaded a frightful sick headache and went to bed. When Jim came home late that night, Agnes was asleep. I caught him in the hall and gave him the telegram. She had to be told, we decided, because a letter from Mississippi might come at any time. He broke it to her the next morning. We were all hard hit, but Agnes, from that time on, was a changed woman. Day after day dragged by, and the letter of explanation did not come. It was strange, to say the least. The Sunday afternoon following, we were all sitting, after dinner, in the little parlour. None of us had been saying much. Suddenly Agnes said: "Jim." "Yes?" "Wasn't it strange that father never said how or when Bob died?" "Would have made the telegram too long and expensive, perhaps," Jim replied. We were all thinking, in the pause that followed, the same thing, I dare say. Agnes's father was not poor, and it did seem he might have done that much. "And why do you suppose I was not to come under any circumstances? And why don't they write?" Just then the bell rang, and there was no chance for a reply. Jim got up in his leisurely way and went to the tube. Agnes and I both listened, a little tensely, I remember. "Yes," we heard Jim say, and then, with spaces in between, "Joe? Joe who? I think you must have made a mistake. No, I can't say that I do know any one called Joe. What? Milton? Yes, that's my name." What? Oh, Brooks. Joe Brooks? But Agnes waited for no more. She rushed by me into the hall. Jim! Jim! It's my brother Joe. To be continued in October issue of the Birth Control Review. End of The Closing Door by Angelina W. Grimké.